be leading the program today on getting folks involved, mobilized on and how to volunteer with the helpline. Before we get started, I will be turning things over to Phil briefly, but I wanted to just go over some logistics. If you are online right now, you are muted. We are just I do believe everyone is muted, but I just received a question from the chat. I will make double sure of that. If you can keep yourselves on mute, that would be most helpful, just so that we can keep the focus on Phil's presentation and on his words. I know that sometimes wherever we're watching this, the environment can be unlike our classroom environment or unlike any other type of programming environment. So we do ask for everybody to keep their microphones on mute. Also, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. You can either put them into the chat directed to everyone, or you can just direct it privately to me. I would be happy to answer them. And what I'm planning to do is keep an eye on the chat. And if there are questions that are coming up in the chat, I will make sure that Phil gets those questions, either put them in the queue for later or ask him if they're relevant to what he's talking about at the moment. So we are going to keep the chat going, and I will keep an eye on that. Also, we are recording this for posting later on the University of Richmond Law School's website. So I know that there are a number of folks who are not able to participate today who would like to get involved in the eviction helpline. So just be mindful that we are recording this program, and if there are any questions or concerns about that recording, please feel free to send it to me in the chat, or you can also email me at tkc@richmond.edu. Just a reminder, I know that there have been a number of people who've just joined us. I am Tara Casey. I'm the director of the Carrico Center for Pro Bono and Public Service at the University of Richmond School of Law. And it is our pleasure and our pride to be able to partner with the Virginia Poverty Law Center in offering this training on how law students and soon-to-be grads can get involved in the eviction helpline, which is managed by the wonderful Phil Story, housing attorney with the Virginia Poverty Law Center and director of the helpline. So Phil, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you. And everyone should be able to see Phil's slides on their screens. He has shared that with them. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me at tkc@richmond.edu, or you can put them in the chat to me privately. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Phil, for doing this for us today.
Thank you, Tara. I really appreciate your organizing this, getting it set up and everything. So welcome, everybody. It's so good to have such a large group of law students joining us. So it was not that long ago that I was a law student, although sometimes it feels longer, but I graduated into the last economic collapse that we had 10 years ago or 11 years ago. And things like this kind of make you appreciate the opportunities that you have and the things that we take for granted a lot of times. And one of the things that you have is right now is a legal education. And that can be incredibly valuable for so many people who are right now, as you know, facing a lot of uncertainty. And of course, that uncertainty stretches way beyond just their housing situation, but their housing situation is a big part of that as they lose income, as they quarantine, as they are worried about all kinds of other issues, medical debts, and just all kinds of things. So I'm here to introduce you, to help you, to give you an orientation to Virginia's eviction crisis and the eviction legal helpline, which I started up in it's really January of last year that it launched. But so I'm going to set the stage and let you know kind of why this was an issue a couple of years ago, and why we addressed it and how we're addressing it, not just in terms of the eviction legal helpline, but in terms of other resources as well. And then we're going to go over a little bit what the helpline does, what its purpose is, what the eviction, well, first we're going to go over some of the causes of the eviction crisis as it was and as it is now, how the helpline, eviction legal helpline, tries to address that, and then what the role is for volunteers, both volunteer attorneys and non-attorney volunteers who can help to meet the huge need that we have in the community. So even before this whole thing happened, Virginia was facing an eviction crisis, and it was no surprise to advocates and legal aid attorneys and tenants throughout Virginia that this was the case. But it really kind of made a splash in April 2018 when on the front page of the New York Times there was an article filed from Richmond about a wave about evictions and how disruptive they are and what a problem they are. So Virginia, of course, we like to be number one. You know, we like the attention, and just a little shout out to my alma mater there. They've got another year of that since the March Madness was canceled. But so here there are some things that Virginia does not want to be number one in. And we should not want to be number one in eviction rates. And so as you see here, this is data from 2016 that was first gathered and released in 2018 when that article came out. But it shows that Virginia's got a big problem with very high eviction rates. So half of the top 10 large cities in the country and three of the top 5 mid-sized cities in the country with the highest eviction rates are in Virginia. That's not a good distinction. And there are some reasons why that is, and we will get into those in a second. But so that tells you that there's something going on, and it's not something good, but what does that really mean? Well, let's look at some of what it means for some of the people who have called the Eviction Legal Helpline. So one, and this was in far southwest Virginia, and these are all actual stories. So there was a mother with 2 teenagers who was being harassed by her landlord. Her landlord had rented her a little house, but then decided that he wanted her out, and so he cut off their. First of all, he would just bother her, tell her to get out, even though she had a lease. He actually went inside the house and turned off the electric circuit that goes to the water heater, and then put a padlock on the circuit board. He would call her at work and tell her that her 2 teenagers were at home alone, and if she didn't get them, he was going to call the police. I don't know why he would be calling the police. Anyway, eventually she got fired because she had to leave work to respond to this guy's threats. And he brought a legal eviction case against her. Because of the information we gave her, she was able to fight that eviction case and was able to stay there while she was figuring something else out, where to go. There was a senior citizen with a mental health disability who was in her apartment complex for years. They got new management. The new management decided, we're going to get rid of all the riffraff here. And so they looked at people's criminal records. Well, several years earlier, when she was not compliant with her treatment regime, she had gotten some minor legal matter, a misdemeanor, and so they wanted to get her out. Well, we were able to refer her to a fair housing lawyer who was able to stop that. They gave her a reasonable accommodation for that old criminal matter, and so her housing, she didn't lose her housing. So there was a disabled veteran whose Social Security check came late one time. Well, that just started a whole series of late fees and everything. So he was being evicted. And then this was especially egregious. Somebody who was a mobile home park resident, owned her mobile home. The law says that they can't just yank someone's mobile home out of the park, even if they get an eviction, if the person stays up on rent. Well, she did. And in fact, the attorney had promised that they were going to let her keep paying the rent and leave the home on the lot if she didn't live there. Well, then on Easter weekend, they decided, no, we were just kidding, and they actually yanked her home off the lot on Easter weekend. So these are some of this is what an eviction crisis looks like in some of these cases. So so that's what it looks like. One of the things that we see a lot of, and that we'll talk a little bit about, is how you, as a volunteer, will get sort of a grassroots, like a worm's eye view of what this really looks like, the eviction crisis, as you take more and more calls. What are the causes of the eviction crisis? Well, there's a lot of causes, but essentially I think there's three main causes. One, there's definitely a lack of affordable housing. So a lot of the folks that we hear from on the helpline are paying, if they have current income. So a lot of folks, maybe they lost their job and that's why they're falling behind, and they currently have no income. But the folks that do have current income are paying an average of 50 to 60% of their income on just rent alone. That is way beyond sustainable. There's just not enough affordable housing. Then there are laws that arguably favor landlords. Of course, you ask a landlord, they're not going to see it that way, but there are many ways that Virginia's laws are especially difficult on tenants compared to other states' laws. And then there's just a tenant can't find lawyers to represent them. There's legal aid, and legal aid does a fantastic job. Their lawyers around the state are the best at fighting these wrongful evictions or fighting eviction cases, but there's just not enough of them. And private lawyers just won't take these cases. There's no money in it. So these are three things that have always been putting pressure on folks and creating this eviction crisis in Virginia. Well, then what do you have? Well, now we've got the coronavirus, and just like the I don't know what it was. So I'm revealing my ignorance here, but just like the gamma ray experiment gone wrong with the Hulk, the coronavirus sort of turns these existing pressures into something far worse and far more dangerous to families, as now we're seeing families that are facing potential eviction, many more families. So, well, what are the effects of an eviction? Well, the effects of an eviction on somebody who is a tenant, a renter, if somebody gets evicted, they're going to be assessed landlord's attorney's fees and court filing costs, in addition to the rent that they owed. They often lose their household possessions, or many of their household possessions. They have to come up with a new deposit and first month's rent. They end up with disruptions that can cost them their jobs. They lose public benefits sometimes. So they're evicted, they move someplace else, and their Medicaid renewal application for their kids doesn't go to the right place. In fact, sometimes I've had clients who multiple times went to DSS, Department of Social Services, and updated their address, still never got their Medicaid application renewal information. And then on top of all that, you move someplace new, and maybe the neighbor who you relied on for childcare, or the relative around the corner who used to give you a ride to work when you needed it, is no longer there. And so there's just all kinds of things that are very expensive and hard on people when they get evicted. And then there is this downward housing spiral. This is something that is very apparent, and we're trying to figure out better ways of actually measuring it. But so there are these things called tenant screening companies, which you may or may not know about. But when you apply for housing, so let's say you find an apartment complex, you want to move in there, you fill out the application, you give it to them with some money, and they run it through this tenant screening company. And they're like credit agencies, credit reporting agencies, and they will check, and depending on the criteria that particular landlord has told them, I want you to evaluate, or I want you to score, or whatever, they will check. But it's almost always includes, does this person have previous evictions or judgments against them for unpaid rent, things like that. And so the more times that you get sued for eviction or actually get evicted, the worse your housing options. And so one of the things that with the data that we have through the eviction helpline, but also other things that we're trying to take a look at is, can we actually quantify or figure out, like, if somebody goes through has like 8 unlawful detainers filed against them in a 3-year period, are the earlier ones from relatively safer and zip codes with better schools, and the later ones from less safe zip codes with worse schools? But those are the kinds of things that really have terrible effects on people as a result of evictions. So we also know, and we don't know why, but we know that evictions disproportionately affect African Americans. We're trying to get data that helps us understand why this is the case and what we can do about it. But the data shows us that it does. Evictions affect African Americans more than white folks. So this is something, it's a big issue. It hits the front page of the New York Times, and there's attention to it. And so there have been some responses in the last couple of years to the eviction crisis. One is increased research attention to evictions. And that is at a variety of levels, but one thing that we have that started up is the RVA Eviction Lab at VCU. There's the Eviction Lab at Princeton, which is the one that gathered the national data and that fed that New York Times article. But we've got folks at VCU who are looking at specifically Richmond, but also a little more statewide too. What do the numbers really tell us about Virginia's eviction crisis? So we've had some changes to the landlord-tenant laws. Last year, there were 7 laws that were passed that made it a little more favorable to tenants that discouraged evictions. This year, there were a couple more that passed, so that's helpful. There are eviction diversion pilot programs, and this was passed through the Assembly last year. There's one in Richmond and 3 others, one in Danville, Newport News, and Petersburg, I believe. So there's 4 eviction diversion pilot programs that are starting up later this year.
And Phil, can I interrupt you just for a quick second?
Yeah.
Just to put in a little plug, we are also going to be doing a program on Thursday with the Greater Richmond Bar Foundation's Justice Server, who is one of the foundation partners of the eviction diversion pilot program that has been successful here in Richmond and working toward expansion across the state. So if anyone is interested in that program, that is Thursday at 2:00. We'll be doing a webinar with Allie Fannin, Executive Director of the Greater Richmond Bar Foundation. So sorry to interrupt you, but I just thought it'd be a good little pitch to make.
Yeah, Richmond got an early start because what came out of the General Assembly last year, that's set to start this year in 2020. But last year, Richmond City Council allocated money to start up an eviction diversion program in the city of Richmond. So they've been going since October, and they have kind of worked out some of the kinks and have great insights into what's actually working, what's not, and things like that. And so those would be great opportunities too. So there has been funding for more legal aid attorneys to help tenants. That's always helpful. We started up the eviction helpline, eviction legal helpline. Also this year, so with the coronavirus and the crisis that's creating, a few weeks ago, Congress passed the CARES Act, and that includes an eviction moratorium for covered properties, which is not all properties, but it's a lot of them. And that is essentially a moratorium that will protect folks in covered properties if they lose income because of the coronavirus until August. So that's super helpful. An eviction freeze in Virginia during the judicial emergency So the governor has declared a state of emergency through early June. The Supreme Court has declared a judicial emergency. Right now, it's set to go for another 2 weeks. The Supreme Court has to can't declare those emergencies for longer than 21 days, but it's everyone's expectation that that will be extended after April 26th. And then there is likely to be some more relief coming, fingers crossed. So those are things that have happened and are happening to respond to this eviction crisis. So we're going to talk about the Eviction Legal Helpline and what we do and what you can do to help respond to this crisis and to help people who are at risk of losing their housing. So the scope and the purpose of the legal helpline is to provide free and accurate legal information and specific legal advice to tenants about a potential eviction. We don't provide legal representation or in court or in negotiating with the landlord, but people call up, they can get information which is, this is what the law says generally, and they can talk to a lawyer who can then look over the specifics of their case and tell them what their legal rights are in the specific case and give them some idea of, you know, here's what a court might do in a situation like this, or typically does in a situation like this. If they are, you've got here, yeah, if they seem to have a defense to eviction, then we can refer them to legal aid if they're eligible for legal aid, or to other legal resources, hopefully. That's something that the lawyer who reviews the case will do with them. But so far, we've referred about 20% of the calls that we get to the eviction legal helpline, we end up referring to local legal aids or to another legal resource for additional advice or representation, hopefully representation. There are many defenses that somebody can raise that really in practice can only be raised by an attorney. Going to court by yourself to defend yourself is intimidating, and sometimes judges are sensitive to that fact, and sometimes they're not. And there really are a lot of things that a lawyer can do that are very difficult realistically for a tenant to raise on their own. So also as a bonus, we get data that we share with these VCU researchers. We ask the tenant or the caller for their permission to share the information, but we get a lot of demographic information, a lot of information about the household and their income and how far they are behind on their rent, you know, race, gender, whether they're veterans, primary language, stuff like that. So that's all helpful. And then the VCU researchers, if the person gives permission, which we ask them for, will call tenants again later and ask them some follow-up questions. So some of the obviously very interesting stuff is, well, what happens to somebody after they've been through this experience, whether they got evicted or not? And those are the kinds of things that the VCU researchers can do with these folks that we've identified. So we created a new model to deal with this need. So as far as I know, there is no other legal helpline that operates on the same model, and our model is to be run largely by volunteers, supervised by attorneys, and managed by attorneys, but largely staffed by volunteers. So there's just way too many tenants who are facing potential eviction for legal aid attorneys to help. Every year in Virginia, more than 150,000 unlawful detainers are filed. And then, you know, you've got people who are unfortunately sometimes evicted or threatened with evictions without going to court. And so it's a huge problem. The resources that would be needed to provide a legal aid attorney to everybody are just staggering. And so we came up with this model. We've designed this so that an army of volunteers, you're the ones at the top here, with the little headsets on, somebody can call in, and an intake volunteer can do the intake, get the necessary information, pass the case along to a volunteer attorney, who can then, with training and supervision from us, from Virginia Poverty Law Center and our specialists in housing law, can then advise the client on their rights. It can be incredibly valuable, just to know what your rights are, even if your rights are not that good. It can be incredibly valuable to know whether it's worth fighting to the death, or saving your money fighting another battle. So this
And
is the model. Yes.
And Phil, can I just interrupt for a second? Because that piece I just wanted to ask a question on, or just to get a clarification on, is that there are folks who are calling this helpline who don't necessarily have like a writ of unlawful detainer in their hands. They may just be having questions about their landlord-tenant situation.
Right.
Or again, like, as you talked about earlier, there's this idea of what an eviction is, and then there's the legal definition of an eviction. So people might feel like they're under threat of eviction when legally they may not be, but constructively they are. And so all of those people are calling the helpline.
So anytime somebody, our scope is, if somebody is facing a potential eviction or lease termination, they can call us and we can give them advice. If they if their landlord's not making repairs that they need to make, or things like that, that's outside of our scope, and we will refer people to other resources that can help them within that scope. But everything from, and here's what the eviction, the legal process of an eviction looks like, and everything along that timeline. We get calls from people who are anywhere in that process, or are before that process even starts. So they haven't gotten anything in writing from their landlord, or their landlord changed their locks without going to court, or things like that. And so the legal process of eviction has, the way we've divided it here is into 9 different steps. And so first, in virtually all cases, your landlord has to give you a written notice that says, we're going to terminate your lease. Now, it might say, it might give you, in many instances, it will give the tenant an opportunity to cure whatever violation of the lease the landlord is alleging. So if it's that you haven't paid your rent and it's the 15th of the month, then the notice is a 5-day notice that says, hey, you got 5 days to pay, and if you pay all of this, then everything goes back to normal. But if you don't, then we will terminate your lease. Or it might say, you've got a dog, we have a no pets policy, you've got 21 days to get rid of the dog, and if you don't, then on day 31, we're going to terminate the lease and go to court. So so first, they need to give you a notice. Then they file something with the court. That's the summons for unlawful detainer that the tenant will get served from the sheriff or from a private process server, tells them when to show up in court. So then step 3 is the court date. You go, the court will call the case, and the judge will look at the unlawful detainer, maybe ask a couple of questions of the landlord, but then turn to the tenant and say, do you dispute this? Usually, if it's about rent, the judge will just say, are you behind on rent? And if that's the case, the person is behind on rent, then they will get the landlord will get a judgment for possession. If it's more complicated than that, then the court can set it for trial, and you come back in a couple of weeks to present evidence. But if the eviction process continues, then step 4 is the landlord gets a judgment for possession. That means that they can take the next steps to evict somebody. So they have to wait 10 days for the appeal period to run. Appeal is not a very realistic option if you got a judgment for possession against you for unpaid rent, because you have to, within those 10 days, file all the paperwork as well as a bond for the amount that the court says you owe, which if you had that kind of money, you wouldn't have been there in the first place. But during those 10 days, you cannot be evicted. The next step, number 6, is the landlord asks the court clerk to issue instructions to the sheriff to schedule and carry out the eviction. That's called a writ of eviction that the court clerk issues, gives to the sheriff's office. Then the sheriff will show up at the tenant's door with the notice of eviction and the writ. And that will say, we're going to come back. Let's say today's Monday, we're going to come back on Friday morning at 9:30. You've got to be out. We're going to change the locks and put you out. There is something that is new as of July 1st, 2019, that we refer to as extended right of redemption. But if you haven't been in this situation before with this landlord in the past 12 months, then up until 2 business days before the sheriff comes back for the actual eviction, you can pay off everything you owe, and the eviction should be canceled, and the case should be marked as dismissed. That's very new, and courts are still figuring out how they're going to deal with that, and landlords are likely unaware of what that really means or might claim to be. So, and then step 9, that's the actual eviction. I've gotten calls on the eviction helpline literally like less than 5 minutes before the sheriff shows up, and really it's too late at that point to do anything legal to help somebody. So if they can get the landlord, if they can hand the landlord a bunch of money and get them to tell the sheriff to go away, that's great. But the law is not really going to be able to help them at that point. So that's just an overview of the legal eviction process. Generally, it takes from step 2 when they file the summons to step 9, generally takes 5 or 6 weeks in normal circumstances. And that's something that is that a lot of tenants don't really understand and don't understand what their rights are in that process. But we get calls from folks everywhere in this process and before. So there is a basic life cycle to a call to the helpline. The first thing that happens is somebody gets our number, they call, and they leave a voicemail. We ask them to leave certain information, not too much information because we don't want, because there could be conflicts of interest, and so we don't want to get too much information from somebody at the outset, but we ask them for, you know, their name, where they're located, the name of their landlord, are there any upcoming dates, important dates, like is the sheriff going to show up in 2 days, or do you have court in 3 days or whatever. So they leave a voicemail. That's step 1. Step 2 is the intake process, and that's where you will come in, and I'll explain this in more depth. But basically, we take that incoming voicemail and we turn that into a case file. We interview the caller to get some more information. We'll check the court records that are online and find out other information about their history with this particular landlord. Do they have other judgments for possession against them recently? And then we ask them to send us documents or notices if they have that and have the ability to send them in. Obviously, it can be helpful to see the documents, to see the paperwork. And so if they can send us their 5-day pay or quit notice, which is the notice that says you've got 5 days to pay or we'll terminate your lease, there are defenses that we can identify if that notice is defective, and so it can be very helpful to get them to send that stuff in. Sometimes they do, oftentimes they don't or can't, and that's okay. So, but that intake process ends up with a case record that is ready to hand off to an attorney who will then review it, call the person, talk to them again, interview them, get more information and give them advice, and then put in follow-up, some case notes and perhaps follow-up instructions if it's the type of situation where a VPLC lawyer should review it and call them back. So, but that all gets saved in the case record, and then we, the VPLC staff, will review every case. The ones that need follow-up, will call the individual back. If it's the type of case where we can refer to legal aid, we'll get a little bit of additional information from them and evaluate if it looks like they're presumptively eligible for legal aid, and talk to them about that. But then we close the case. So that's the timeline, and typically it should take 2 or 3 business days. That's typical. Now, sometimes we get calls that, of course, are not typical. So here's one case.
Oh,
Yes.
Phil, would you be able to go back to that slide?
Yeah.
I think it just might be helpful to know how much is this timeline and these steps being affected by the current precautions taken in response
Right.
to the coronavirus?
So it's interesting, and it is being affected somewhat. And my guess is, so we're just really getting in. We've had like 2 weeks since it kind of hit the fan with folks' rent becoming due and things like that. And so what I'm expecting is that more stuff, more of the activity of the helpline is going to happen at the intake process going in the next few months, rather than, and many cases will be essentially resolved at the intake process, at the intake stage, because people are calling with sort of very wisely with preemptive questions. Like, I'm losing my income, and what is that going to mean for me? So that can be answered because there are sort of generic answers about, well, here's what the courts are doing right now, and here's what this federal relief package offers to eligible people. But and so that gives somebody a sense of, okay, next week, or the first of the month, I'm not going to be out, and that might be enough for their current, to answer their current question. So my guess is, and then other stuff. So like the CARES Act, the Federal CARES Act, is there are going to be some people who, I think what we're going to ask people to do is to call back for sort of the deeper analysis of their case after they get something from the courts. Because actually figuring out if somebody's in a covered property is going to take a bit of work, and so we're trying to set up kind of the resources so that advocates can figure that out. We don't have that all together yet. So anyway, so the timeline, then, we would love to be able to, if we have the volunteers, to be able to, in one business day, to answer that person's question. And many of those people won't need additional legal advice about their specific situation. But within one business day, I would love to be able to get people complete the intake, get them the basic legal information that might address their question, and then beyond that, I would love to, to compress the timeline as much as possible. But we'll see how that works. Okay, so this is something that happened. It actually happened late last year, but it was, well, actually it happened, I need to refresh my stories here, but this is something that happened after the law changed. July 1st is when new laws take effect in Virginia, typically. And so there was a law change from last July 1st, where earlier, if you had a judgment for possession, in other words, if your landlord had filed an unlawful detainer against you and had gotten a judgment for possession, but then didn't evict you, you caught up on rent and they said, okay, you can stay. They had that judgment of possession in their back pocket, and they could, within the next 12 months, they could use that to evict you without filing another unlawful detainer against you. They could go to the court, get a writ of eviction, and have that executed. And so somebody could have run into a problem in January, have gotten back on their feet and been current on their rent and everything. And then in October, a landlord could decide, you know what, my brother-in-law needs a place to stay. I'm just going to get you out of here. And then within like 4 days, you could be on the street, literally. So we got a call. We were able to pass a law that changed that to reduce that to 6 months. So we got a call in July of last year from somebody lived in a mobile home park, and she got a sheriff's eviction order that was, they're coming back in 5 days to evict her. She had no idea why. Um, and so we looked it up, and it turned out it was an old eviction, or an old judgment for possession against her. It actually shouldn't have been, they shouldn't have taken the judgment for possession because she had paid everything that she owed before that court date. And the landlord, and she didn't show up because she had paid everything. Well, under the law, that should be her exercising her right of redemption, and that the case should have been dismissed. But they took the judgment anyway. But then it had been more than 6 months, just barely more than 6 months, when they got the writ of eviction against her. So we ended up identifying that on the helpline and connecting her with a legal aid attorney who the next day was able to go to court for her and file a motion to stay the eviction and quash the writ, and all those fancy legal things that lawyers get to do in court, and was able to get this eviction canceled, and the lady was able to stay in her home. So that's an example of something where this, 2 to 3 business days is not good enough for a situation like this, and so we escalate that. But that's an example of the way that that a service like this can really make all the difference for a tenant. So I said we'd look a little more carefully at the intake process. This is where we can really use non-attorney volunteers to help. And so this is where we're hoping that you can help out. So the purpose of the intake process is to create a case record that's ready for an attorney to review and advise the client. And that means getting information into that case record. That information comes from the voicemail that somebody leaves, from court records that are online, from documents that they send, and from the interview that we have with them. But it's information about people, so the tenant and the landlord. It's information about the situation that they're in, the facts, and the legal process. And then there's obviously some administrative information, like the client's consent and things like that. So it starts, as I said, with a call from the tenant, and then there's several steps to collect all of the information, and we'll go over those now. So the first step is when somebody calls and leaves a voicemail on the helpline, the phone company turns that into a WAV file or an audio file that they attach to an email, and there's a computer-generated transcription, usually, of what they think the person said in that voicemail. And so then that email with the transcription and the attached audio file gets sent to an email account that is our incoming message account. So the first step that a volunteer will be involved in an intake process is turning that new voicemail into a new case record. So reviewing the voicemail and then opening in our case management system a new case record. And then the next step that we do is we have to run a conflict screening procedure. So one of the great advantages of a helpline like this is that in terms of what we're asking our pro bono attorneys to do, is it's a very short and discreet advice interaction that the attorney has. And because of that, there are special rules, and the bar does not require them to run a conflicts check. So the attorney that opens one of these cases, if they notice that the name on there is somebody that they know they have a conflict with, then they close the case. They can't touch that. But they don't have to actually run a conflicts check. But Virginia Poverty Law Center does need to run a conflicts check, because we are going to be giving additional advice. We're going to be referring somebody. We're going to be gathering and retaining all of the information that people give us. And we have other projects that offer legal advice and representation to people. So we have to run a little conflict screening procedure to check and see if there are any matching names in our database. Then the intake volunteer will call back and interview the tenant and get demographic information and more information about the situation that they're in. And then, and this can happen in step 4, it can actually happen before the interview if we have enough information. So if the person's message said, my name is this, and my landlord is this, and we are located in the city of Norfolk, that's enough information for us to look up their court records. And so sometimes that can happen before the call, but we look up court records online to find out, do they already have a judgment for possession against them from the last 6 months? Have they already exercised their right of redemption potentially? How many cases have been brought against them by this particular landlord? That sort of thing all affects what their rights are going forward. If the client can send us documents or notices, then we get those from the same email inbox as the message, the original message, and we attach those to the case record. And then in the end, when we have finished that, the case record is ready for the attorney to review. Those are the steps that an intake volunteer will take. And as we organize things, we're actually dividing up some of those tasks so that we can have concurrent volunteers working at the same time.
Phil, I got a question from the chat that I wanted to ask.
Yes.
It was, is there a sample case review or progression that people can see that you have, either one
Right.
that is an example, just to use as an example, either that you have available now or that we can then put up on the website later when we post this training?
Yeah, I don't have one right now, but we can put it up. That's a good idea. I'll create something like that. So
Thank you.
yeah, now there are, we do have, however, some very detailed training and reference materials. And when I say detailed, we've got step-by-step instructions for all of these processes, including screen captures. So that will show you, okay, this is actually the button that you will press in our case management system or in the shared inbox where the messages go to complete this step. And even scripts, so that when you call the person back, here is a script that you will say when you're talking to them. So we're not just telling you get this information, we're actually including scripts that you can use. And then, you know, after you've done this with a dozen callers, then you might not need to review to look at the scripts, but we have very detailed instructions for you, and we have video tutorials for the major steps as well, so that show you, here's what it looks like when you open up the screen, and here's where how you proceed from one field to the next. Those are all on evictionhelpline.org, which you'll see the link to in just a little bit. So that's the process that you go through. Throughout this process, it's actually kind of fun. Because you are doing a little bit of investigative work, looking up the court records and things like that, reviewing the paperwork if they send any paperwork or documents or notices. So it's kind of interesting. And then talking to people. So people are in, you know, some people, of course, are extremely sympathetic. Some people are slightly less sympathetic. As with anything dealing with, you know, the broader public, you've got a range of people calling, but this is an opportunity to really see what are these people going through, and hopefully to sort of fuel or spark a little bit of righteous indignation about the legal system, about the way that people treat one another, and about the opportunities that there are for us to help people who are in a tough spot. So we're getting close to the end. Just talk about staffing the helpline. So we have, and you'll see the link in just a minute, but there's a calendar for non-attorney volunteers who are going to be helping with intake, and 3 slots each day for folks who are going to be doing the first part of the intake, which is turning the initial message into a case record, and if there's enough information, looking up the court records, and then 3 slots a day for people doing the rest of the process, which is calling up clients and completing the intake interview and packaging it all together in that case record. Yes.
So Phil, I said another question that came up from the chat, just in terms of logistics. When people are calling the clients back for the helpline messages, are they using a personal cell phone? And
they are.
If so, okay.
Yeah, and you can press *67 before you dial the number, and then it turns it shows up as a private call. Your number is not, the person does not have your phone number in their phone. They will not be giving you a call back and you know, and badgering you after that. So yeah. So all of this, well, we'll get to that, but so this is really, as far as I know, an unprecedented model for a legal helpline service. So there are lots of other legal helplines. The federal government helps fund legal helplines for senior citizens, for elderly folks. There are a lot of other very important legal helpline services that legal aids run, but to my knowledge, they are almost exclusively staffed by paid staff. Because we are dealing with such a narrow legal issue, we believe, have a successful model that's really run by volunteers. And in order to move the needle to really affect this eviction crisis, we're going to need to do that. And so this is something that is new, and we're pioneering this service model together. So you're going to be very valuable in letting us know what's working, what's not working, how we can improve it, and things like that. And the goal, again, as I said, is to really move the needle and help, in a larger sense, help reduce the eviction crisis in Virginia. So the volunteer contribution, what is your role and why are you so valuable? Well, first, you're going to have your finger on the pulse of Virginia's eviction crisis. You're going to hear from people who have just been locked out by their landlord. You're going to hear from people who are, so I had one lady, and I say this, I actually had a couple of cases that are kind of all too similar to this, but a lady who was, an elderly lady, and she was renting a room in a house, and one of the other renters in the house had sexually assaulted her. So she went and got a protective order. The landlord told her that because the sheriff had to come to serve the protective order on the other guy, the landlord said, look, we've got a strict policy that you never call law enforcement to the house. You've got to be out of here in 5 days. She, as you can imagine, she was weeping on the phone with me because she didn't know if she really was going to be on the street in 5 days. Thankfully, she had a good social worker, and DSS connected her with the helpline, and we were able to calm her fears about getting illegally put out, and luckily she was able to find better housing. But there's all kinds of cases that you're going to hear about that'll give you real insights into what's going on. You're going to be able to help contribute to policy proposals to address the crisis. By getting this data, we can really see things that are difficult to see otherwise, and make a real difference for our neighbors who are facing really serious consequences of eviction. So this is just a quote from a volunteer. I've seen how easily eviction can happen to people and how traumatic it can be. Also, how desperately people need a basic understanding of how the system works so they can protect themselves and make good decisions. You will get to see that, and hopefully, and for sure, you will get to see also some positive outcomes like the ones I've been mentioning. So just in the last couple of minutes, so the volunteer commitment, there are 2-hour shifts that you would sign up for. The exact duration and timing can be flexible. VPLC support is available on call virtually always. So my cell phone and a colleague's cell phone, you will have that, and you can text us or call us with questions or information. We can also do individual or small group training and more intensive training. And in fact, what I kind of like to do is, if it's going to be your first time, you can get on a 3-way call and listen to me do an intake and kind of get a sense of what that's going to be like. And then we can debrief afterwards, and we can do that more than once if you want. We're asking for like at least a 4-month commitment, a couple of times a month. So it's not a very heavy commitment, but this is a crisis that we're facing now, especially with the COVID-19 thing, that is not going to go away quickly. And so for the training that we put into it, and just for the volume of need that we anticipate to be out there, we're asking that it's something that you can make a several-month commitment to. And then, of course, client confidentiality is essential. That is like, if you just can't help yourself, and you have to, chat in detail about things like this, this is not the opportunity for you. So how do you get started? So if you go to evictionhelpline.org, yes, Tara.
Sorry, I didn't realize I had still muted. Before we get to that part, I do have a question that came up of the chat regarding the scope of the eviction helpline. And the understanding that we have is that it is mainly for landlord-tenant evictions, like the landlord-tenant relationship. We're not dealing with mortgage foreclosures or any of that potential pipeline. Is there a resource that you would recommend if folks were interested in learning more about foreclosure prevention? I mean, would that be Home?
It might, yeah. Home is one of the what are they, HUD approved foreclosure prevention sort of counselors, but I'm not sure. That's a very good question. It is. I'm pretty laser focused right now, and so I don't know the answer to that. Certainly, it's outside the scope of the eviction helpline. But I'm not sure. Home would probably be good folks to check with.
And I'm going to put the link to Housing Opportunities Made Equal, otherwise known as Home, into the chat for people to follow up there as well. Thanks, Phil.
Sure. Yeah, we are. So we have had, we had one case where somebody had been through a foreclosure. They were the previous homeowner, and now they're considered a holdover tenant to the new homeowner. The new homeowner has to follow certain procedures to evict somebody who used to be the homeowner, and so we helped with that. But if that's the situation that we deal with. So to get started, you go to evictionhelpline.org, and this is the page for potential volunteers. There's a webinar, a previous webinar, orientation webinar that's on that page, as well as some other information. But basically, there are 5 steps to take. From that page, you can take all of those steps. The first step is to read the volunteer manual, and then sign the volunteer agreement. You get a Helpline CMS, which is our case management system, get a user account or request a user account from that, which I will approve then. You view the video tutorials that we have, and then you sign up for a shift. That's it. It's pretty easy. And then you can contact me and say, Phil, this is my name. I've never done this before. I signed up for this shift. Can you step me through the first couple of callbacks or the first couple of times turning a new message into a case record? And we can do that and set that up. So here's just one other example, and this is something very recent. This is since the COVID-19 crisis hit. This was from far Southwest Virginia, somebody who's renting a mobile home on next door to the landlord's house. and the landlord, she didn't have any more work because people are out of work, and the landlord then shut off her water. So this was, I don't know, several days ago. So she had been going to the store and buying water and bringing it back. The landlord wanted her out, physically threatened her, threatened to burn her vehicle. Not good stuff, not legal, not the way you're supposed to do it. But there's not a lot of resources in her community. She called us and we were able to advise her on what her rights were, things she could do in court. Now this was on Good Friday, so the courts were closed. And then advising her to call the sheriff's office and get them involved, because they should know that this is illegal, and they might be able to kind of talk your landlord back from the brink, and which is what happened. She ended up calling the sheriff's office. They came, they got her water turned back on, and they explained to the landlord what he can and can't do legally. So that is something that we are seeing a lot more illegal evictions since this whole thing happened, because the courts are closed, and some landlords don't have to wait around and for the courts to open and take things into their own hands. So that's something that is likely over the next few weeks, especially, to be again a pretty frequent type of call. If you have any follow-up questions, you can contact me. But let me just tell you that the role that you will play is enormous. It might be the first time that somebody is. A lot of times, people are calling us, and we're like the third call or the fifth call or the 10th call that they've made. And nobody can give them any information or help them. And so you might be the first person who can actually sort of calm their nerves a little bit and give them legal information. We have scripts in the manual for types of legal information that you can give that do not put you at risk of unauthorized practice of law, that you can go through these scripts and explain to them. For different situations. If you are in a hotel or motel and your landlord the management is telling you have to get out tomorrow, or they're going to change the locks tomorrow. If your landlord is threatening to put you out or has already put you out illegally, here's what one can do. Here's what the eviction process looks like and how long it takes. That information is incredibly valuable to somebody who thinks that because they got a notice from the landlord, they're days away from being homeless on the street. And then just the human contact when someone's in a desperate situation, they've been unable to get anybody to really take any interest in this incredibly traumatic situation. You're going to be in those situations, and it's incredibly valuable, and it's gratifying, and you learn a lot, and it's very interesting. So thank you for your interest in this. I hope you will follow through on this and sign up and help us out. And if there are any questions, please feel free to give me a call. My cell phone's the best way to reach me, especially nowadays, and email. But thank you for coming and joining us. Thank you so much, Tara Casey and U of R and the Carrico Center for setting this up. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. And I do know that people may need to hop off because of other commitments, but I do just want to give one more opportunity to folks to ask any questions off of the chat. I hope I got to all the ones that did appear, but if you do have any questions, as I tell my students, there's no expiration date for questions. So please feel free to either email me at tcasey, T-C-A-S-E-Y, at richmond.edu, or Phil Story at, as you see there, phil@vplc.org, with any questions for follow-up. And I put both of those email addresses in the chat as well. Thank you so much, Phil, for this help.
One other thing that I'll say, so it kind of gets to one of the earlier questions in the chat, but about the substantive law around eviction. So you as an intake volunteer, we want you to review and read volumes 1 and 2 of the volunteer manuals. But you also have access to volume 3, which is the volunteer attorneys manual, and that explains not only the sort of nuts and bolts of the process that a volunteer attorney will use to help people on the helpline, but it has all the defenses. It has a description of the legal regime and what the laws are that govern this, and then the various defenses and when to look for them and how to raise them and things like that. So that's something that, especially for law students, you might be very interested in taking a look at.
Thank you so much, Phil. And thank you so much for everyone who has attended this virtually. I appreciate your time, and I really do hope you all get involved. This is going to be an issue that is only going to become more acute as time goes on, and it's a wonderful way to help remotely address the current eviction situation in Virginia, and unfortunately the one that is most likely to come. So thank you, Phil, so much for being with us. I am
Thank
going
you.
to end the recording and end the webinar, and I hope you all stay safe, remain well, and take care.